So we know that one of the stories, again, that we're telling here is how we end up with modernity, where we get these three distinct spheres of knowledge, magic, science, and religion, that really start to diverge sharply around this time, around the time of the Scientific Reformation, around the time of the Scientific Revolution, and find their clearest articulation in the aspirations of those Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century. So these 3 centuries we're going to talk about, the 1500s, the 1600s, and the 1700s, are a bridge. They're our early modern period. They are transitioning us from that medieval cosmos. The distinct things we needed to know about that medieval worldview was that it was derived from a Catholic theology, that the Catholic Church supervised all the forms of knowledge, whether it was how to go to heaven, what are the spiritual practices and beliefs, what is the theology that is going to ground your salvation. They're in charge of the supernatural realm, also in charge of how the heavens go. They need to have a very systematic and organized concept of naturalism. Did the Bible give them that? No, that is not part of the Old or New Testament canon, this kind of sophisticated program of natural philosophy. For that, they needed to go to the Greeks. If they wanted to be masterful, not just spiritually, not just supernaturally, but masterful over how the heavens go, their best source was the Greeks. And finally, the most comprehensive philosopher of the ancient Greeks was Aristotle, who wrote hundreds of books on many different subjects. Not all of them survive, but the church in the Middle Ages, through the aid of Thomas Aquinas, decided to assimilate that knowledge. So when we talk about that Catholic cosmos of the medieval period, we're not just talking about the Bible. We're not just talking about the supernatural. We're also talking about a vast and complex worldview that included natural philosophy, a very complex program of natural philosophy and logic. Today we're going to talk, because we're talking about Descartes, we're going to talk about epistemology, how we know what we know. Well, there were Aristotelian forms of knowledge and learning. So it was a full-service program that the church was running. They were running the show from top to bottom. They were also in control of how do we know what we know. First and foremost, we have God's word in the Bible. Faith is a prominent epistemology in the medieval period. But we also know that it was an intellectual enterprise that also valued argumentation, disputation, Aristotelian logic. So logic and reason were part of this, but Aquinas was very clear about this relationship, that this Aristotelian reason was going to be the handmaid of religion. It would defer to theology. So when we're talking about this early modern period, we're talking about the bridge out of that worldview, where we had a combined cosmology, where all these forms of knowledge were one. We had religion being the overarching framework, and within that religious system, we had natural philosophical programs, and even, but more uncomfortably, we had magic, right? We had the philosophical alchemy of Aristotle. But we know that this worldview, this Catholic cosmology, is under pressure. It is breaking apart. One of the things that we're looking for in this transitional period, because it's one of the things we need to explain what happens, is why is magic exiled? Why do we have a world, and we talked about this in our introductory lecture, why do we have a world where both religion and science are highly authoritative, institutional presences, right? That they have divided their spheres of expertise. One is about natural knowledge, one about supernatural, and they both share a certain amount of clout. But we also discussed that even though magic has tremendous and perhaps more pervasive than we're entirely comfortable with, tremendous influence in our culture, it is largely through the private sphere driven by consumerism and our personal search for belief. But the public sphere has been ceded to magic and science. So where do we get that? So answering that question that I've just posed, let's refer back to what happens with the Catholic Church around this period of the Reformation. One of the things they're trying to do is purge themselves of magic. They are now trying to demonize certain ways of relating to the supernatural are appropriate and priestly and in accordance with God's will. But certain rogue elements are trying to relate to the supernatural in a bad way. And those are the magicians. Those are the Hermetic philosophers. So they, even though we know that the evolution of the idea of witchcraft is much slower, and we track that through the Middle Ages, it really explodes, really catches on fire, literally, right? In the 1500s, this period between 1550 and 1650, and that is our crisis period, not just for the Reformation, but for the scientific revolution. And we know that at this point, it has become crucial for the church to purge itself of magic. Why? Well, the church is no longer the only one saying how to go to heaven. You've got all these Reformation theologians who are making critiques and saying, your sacramental system isn't in the Bible. The Bible doesn't tell us to worship saints. In fact, that looks a lot like magic and the very sort of Satanism that you've been haranguing against. So the church has to become very clear about rationalizing its belief system. It's trying to rationalize its relationship to the supernatural. So we're used to thinking about rationalizing our relationship to nature as becoming more materialistic, more mechanistic. That's going to happen today when we talk about Galileo and Descartes and mechanism. That program of rationalism, so key to transiting from a medieval worldview to a modern cosmology, that rationalization is also happening in the place of the supernatural. So the church doesn't want to let go of the supernatural. It doesn't want to deny that we live in a world that is supernaturally guided and overseen, and that we in some ways proceed from this larger supernatural premise of God and creation. But they don't like all these other people trying to control what that supernature means and how to get there. They don't like the Reformation theologians saying, we'll tell you how to get to God through faith and through the Bible. But they also don't like those witches, the low magicians, the peasants, those practicing spells in their huts with the eye of a toad, and who are dredging up all of these ancient agricultural formula, the sediment of agricultural peasant cults that remained and that became intertwined with Catholic sacramental system. So all of this magic that the peasants are practicing isn't anti-Christian. These peasants would have considered themselves Christian. So what the church has to do is say, I'm going to define your relationship to the supernatural as invalid, as inauthentic. It is, in fact, satanic. So it's telling all these low magicians, all these witches, all these medicine women and the midwives that they are no longer allowed to traffic in magic. But they can't banish the premise of a supernatural world, or else they lose the sphere that brings them the most authority. Who else do they attack? The high magicians, right? They go after the Hermetical philosophers. We don't hear as much about them because they're richer, more powerful, and don't end up at the stake very often. We had an instance of Giordano Bruno. John Dee was under arrest for some time for accusations of conjuring. But you see, the church is trying to control how you go to heaven. And now it has to contend with practices that it used to not be threatened by. So the peasants practiced a little agricultural magic. So the priests behaved in a somewhat shamanic way, blessing fields, blessing babies, acting as if they themselves are semi-divine. They were able to wink at that. Why? they controlled the whole system. But the minute you get the Reformation theologians demanding that they reconcile their beliefs and practices with what it says in the Bible, that's when you get the need to rationalize. So the Reformation is very important in terms of driving magic out, because it imposes on the Catholic Church not just the anxiety that there are these Reformation critics outside of themselves, but they actually have to internalize part of this Reformation critique. They have to themselves reform. It's called the Counter-Reformation. And at the other side of that Counter-Reformation, the Church is far less magical, has decided that alchemical philosophers are now satanic, that its priests must practice a purely miraculous relationship with the supernatural. It is very clear when a priest performs a blessing, he is not indeed initiating that blessing from any access to some font of this supernatural power that permeates the world. He's merely a channel, a vessel. A miracle comes from on high. It is from divine initiative. Priests may petition. Saints may petition. But all the power is focused in God. That's a rationalization of the supernatural. Why? Because it's reductive, it simplifies, it clarifies, and it puts all of this magical potential in the hands of one miraculous deity who is rational, wise, kind. So again, the world is not full of enchanted forests and demons and spooks that you can repel if you say the magical right enchanted formula or wear the right medallion. This is a rationalized relationship with the supernatural. So when we say magic is being pushed out of the world, hopefully that put in a little context how magic is being expelled from the church, even while the church still absolutely promotes a view of the supernatural and a relationship to God. But it rationalizes the church's theological beliefs and who is allowed to interact with the Creator. We're also going to talk today about how magic is chased from science. Because when we looked at modernity, right, we had religion and we had science, both drawing a distinct boundary between themselves and magic. The Catholic Church doesn't necessarily want to be involved or seen as exorcists or practicing voodoo. It's a little embarrassing for them if they find out people are worshiping saints, right? That's embarrassing. They don't want to be seen as a magical enterprise. And we talked already about science's attitude towards magic, to all of that sort of what they would call the bunkum and the hokum of these claims, like airborne is going to magically create a shield that's going to deflect germs. They would call that a sort of new age, not based in science, fraud, a kind of magical claims that have no basis in reality. Magic is fine as long as it's a form of entertainment. That's where magic has been exiled to by both science and religion. It's a form of entertainment. It is an element of the consumer realm. But we need to understand how magic gets chased out of the cosmos by our new scientists, our new natural philosophers, because so far we've been talking about the program of science, and it has absolutely moved in the milieu, evolved, unraveled in the context of alchemy, philosophical alchemy and hermetic alchemy, right? This was an experimental program with the philosophers, the Aristotelian philosophers, who were practicing all of that alchemy that looked a lot like chemistry. And then it became a more intellectual, metaphysical, cosmological program, because now it's really having its own independent philosophy about nature, about supernature. Then it becomes very dangerous, but still, when we tell the story of science, we know that Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, that these people are, and even Newton, as we're going to discuss today, these people are formulating their ideas in the theoretical context saturated with alchemical assumptions. So how are we going to get into this new kind of science that, like the church, has chosen to push magic out of its sphere, to exile it? We know from last Thursday's lecture, it's Galileo who makes this decisive break, who has this extraordinary departure. The Aristotelian blinders fall from his eyes, and he is able to imagine the world in a way that it has never been so thoroughly imagined. Now, careful, because we do have mechanical philosophy kicking around in antiquity. All of this is the return of the repressed. We don't get modernity without antiquity. And that's why we talked so much about antiquity at the beginning of the course. However, what Galileo does is truly revolutionary. He takes this mechanical philosophy much farther. So let's just, without getting all hung up on his formulas and his specific scientific aspects of his theories, let's see again, because we were a little rushed last time, what are the most basic things we need to understand to spin our heads 180 degrees and suddenly be looking out into a universe that is disenchanted. Looking at the sky in a way that nobody, for hundreds of years, at least in medieval Europe, would have thought to imagine the sky. Well, remember, he's breaking from the Aristotelian understanding of matter, which was amatory matter, psychological matter, matter that does stuff because it's internally motivated. Water merges with other wet things because wet things want to merge together. If you want to understand the nature of that motion of water, you need to understand it qualitatively, psychologically. You need to understand that that is a specific desire, not a quantitative thing. It has nothing to do with numbers. It has to do with the aspect of the sort of affect that God gave it at creation. Affect, affection, something that has to do with emotions and dispositions. That is this universe of amatory matter. And quite frankly, if you lived prior to the scientific revolution, how would you explain why one thing moves and moves someplace else? I mean, really, there's just no premise for understanding how forces work. So this is the main idea we're going to refute. And in order to refute it, he needed to put a few things in place. In a very sketchy way, I'm just going to reiterate these things. You have an option of answering this kind of question on the test. You don't have to. But for those of you who want to, I'm just going to reiterate this narrative of this importance of this mechanical revolution, how we get a mechanistic universe. Remember the law of falling bodies? Well, Galileo, one of his famous experiments, some people say it's legend, but he probably actually did some version of this stuff, where he goes up into the Leaning Tower and he drops objects made of the same stuff, but of varying size. So maybe a 10-pound cannonball versus a 5-pound cannonball. Now, Aristotle and the rest of the medieval world, there were some people that were experimenting with this idea, but let's just leave them out of it for now. No, for this whole course, let's leave them out of it. Okay, so we're just going to say the Aristotelian worldview would have been, oh, there's 10 pounds of that matter and only 5 pounds of that matter. Well, the heavier matter, though that which weighs more, is going to get to the ground more. It's going to fall more rapidly. And if you probed him as to why, one of the reasons he might have given was more matter, more desire to get to the center of the world, because there's more of them. Just as if you put 5 men pulling a log versus 10 men pulling a log, well, there's more matter working together to affect its desire. Problem, matter doesn't have a desire. So when you actually drop these things off of a Leaning Tower of Pisa, as Galileo noted for us, gee, they actually fall at the same time and even at the same rate. So this is where he comes up with his law of motion, the law of falling bodies, right? Where all things fall at a speed that is proportional to the rate, not to how heavy they are, but they're accelerating proportional to how long they've been falling. So all matter is the same. It just means how long this matter has been falling. By the way, I'm talking about physics in the 1600s. Okay, we are not talking about physics in the 19th and 20th century. where inertia is going to start to mean once we understand that matter is in fact has these subatomic elements and that all of these energies are actually aspects of matter, this story is going to go out the window, but this story is really important for us right now. So this is inert matter that is acted on, that does not act. So there is some force when you drop that bowling ball that has nothing to do with the actual matter. The matter is inert. It's a force that is acting on matter, and it's acting on all matter the same way, so it's going to fall at a rate that the time is proportional to the rate of acceleration. Now just store that away, and here's the important idea that we get from that, because we got to get to inertia. We need to get to inertia in order to understand this crazy mechanical universe, because where's the motion coming from? Where's this force coming from? If it's not coming inside, what's going to motivate matter to move if it's not coming from inside? Well, here's the deal. Galileo figures out you don't need to motivate matter to move, because matter conserves whatever motion it happens to be traveling in, right? So this is if a motion, a piece of matter, or if it's traveling along a plane, uninterrupted, say that cannonball, there's no friction. He also is figuring all that stuff out. It's going to travel uninterrupted. It's just going to keep going until it hits that wall. It's going to be interfered with, and it's going to stop. So matter itself conserves motion, because there's nothing inside matter that can say, oh, I want to slow down now. Get it? It has no desire to motivate itself, ergo, it has no desire to stop itself. That means if I throw a ball at a certain speed, it's going to travel a certain speed. If while it's moving, I hit it again, it's going to conserve the initial motion and combine that with the new acceleration of the second amount of energy I give it. And until it slams into a brick wall, it's not going to stop. That, right now, so intuitive to us, revolutionary. This is the thing that Aristotle didn't get, because if you're trying to understand why matter moves, in a way, this is a totally Aristotelian question. Why does something get from here to there? Because it wants to, and it's going to achieve its ends once it's stopped. The de facto, the default, the superior position in this Aristotelian world is being at a state of rest. Because you're not moving, that means you don't want to move, right? You don't want to move, that means you must be happier where you are, because, you know, if I put this here, that means if that was a stone, it's closer to the earth, it's going to be in a happier state there than it was here, and it's going to stop. But Galileo understands on some profound level that matter and that motion is completely relative. So this is another important word we're introducing here, relativity. This concept of relativity is introduced very on and breaks with the Aristotelian precedent. I am on a bridge. You are on a boat. You are holding a cannonball. I watch you go by. You, your cannonball, the ship, you're all moving. Me, I'm still. Alien, watching me from outer space, on the bridge, sees I'm spinning. Who's right? Nobody. Motion is all relative. It doesn't mean anything to matter. Motion is all relative. It's all from the point of view. And again, it's difficult to link that concept to this notion that motion is all relative, because whether you're going faster or slower is not relevant to the point of to some internal motivation of matter, right? If the cannonball that is being held in your arms as you're on the boat isn't going to try to leap it out of your arms because it wants to be more still relative to the boat, right? It has no agenda. Those are hard concepts to link, and yet this is the philosophical revolution that we're talking about. This is the head spin. This is how inertia and relativism and getting the enchantment out of matter all come together in these simple exercises, right, of dropping objects, rolling objects down hills, dropping objects, analyzing motion. And when Galileo analyzes motion, what does he figure out about it? He figures out it's quantifiable. If you really want to understand this stuff, don't understand the quality of what it wants to do. There are underlying patterns in its behavior, and they can be mathematically formulated. You want a handle on this universe? That handle is not qualitative. You want to understand motion and matter? That relationship is quantitative. And you want to understand why the world is in motion and we don't need to get obsessed about where motion comes from? Because everything is in motion all the time, relative to each other. So you can put aside this obsessive question, why do things move? They move because that is the nature of matter, to conserve motion. So once there's motion in the universe, it stays there. So we don't have to worry about that. And the only motion you need to explain in this universe, really, is who set the universe in motion to begin with. God. We got a role for God here. It's limited, but there is a role for God. We need a prime mover. But once you put the motion into the universe, it's conserved, and it just transfers itself, and we don't need to worry about individual atoms getting any bright ideas of their own. So hopefully, we're getting this mechanical universe. However, here's the problem with Galileo. People are incredibly excited about his ideas. And as I've said, on every level, they knock out Aristotle. Remember, Galileo is also the bold-faced Copernican that shows you, in fact, that the Earth is going around the sun. And just because you can't feel that you're moving, relative to the planet of the Earth, you're standing still. Relative to the sun, you're moving. See how relative motion and Copernicanism go hand in hand? He attacks the Copernican system. Why was that important? Brings down that lovely theological architecture of the cosmos. You know, when we had the realm of change and decay, and then the super celestial sphere, and then the angels, the archangels, the high angels, and God. It worked. It was a buttress for the church's theology and the basis for their natural philosophy. And he has torn this worldview down. What's he going to replace it with? We got a few interesting experiments. We've got some treatises on motion. We've got some things that are no longer theoretical. He draws us Copernicanism. He shows us Copernicanism. But now you have to understand, every single book in the university was put there by Aristotelians and... Okay, so everybody in the university system is reading what? From their Aristotelian handbook. The whole engine of education is driven by the church and Aristotle. If they take Aristotle out of the universities, they're going to leave a very dangerous vacuum. And who's going to run into that vacuum? Not a bunch of priests, because the priests have lost control of nature. Why? This nature, remember, to get a handle on it, it's about math and quantification. Who are going to be the new high priests of this mechanical nature? They're going to be mathematicians and natural philosophers. So if the church pulls its Aristotelian program that it's so invested in, there's going to be a vacuum. So let's put it this way. If the church didn't have this awkward political situation with the Reformation and with the Renaissance princes trying to rival them for authority, if they were in charge of the educational system, if instead of Galileo going, yes, I'll tell you how the heavens go, if Galileo had said, like Aquinas, let me find a formula that works for you. Let me find a way of making this mechanics less scary so the church can still be in charge of nature. If they had had that option, we probably wouldn't have had a scientific revolution. We would have had a Catholic reformation of Aristotelian assumptions in nature, right? If they could have just brought these natural philosophers on board and Catholicized their agenda, made them handmaidens. But you see how explosive it is? You see how this mechanical philosophy is not an adaptation. It's a revolution that the church had hundreds and hundreds of years invested in this edifice of Aristotelian theory and theology to the point where once this modern idea came, there is no way to be medieval and modern. Game over, right? There's no reconciliation here. The church is going to have to change. And if the church wants to survive, then the church is going to have to change its medieval notions that they're in charge of how to go to heaven and how the heavens go. So we got this idea now, people loving these mechanics, but where are the educational systems to teach this? Where's the funding going to come from? Where are the books? I mean, the whole medieval system in the educational system is still intact. So you can imagine it's like a giant tidal wave has come in, wiped everything out. When it recedes, there's really nothing but a few exciting Galilean ideas. The old cosmology gone, the old physics gone, and these philosophers are desperate for a new order. Galileo's not going to give it to them. Galileo's an empiricist, an experimenter. He likes dropping things off of towers, not sitting in those towers thinking about the nature of the cosmos, right? He's out and about doing things. Being the mathematician, you need someone who's going to step up, someone of almost unbridled hubris, who's going to step into the vacuum of knowledge and say, hold on, everybody. I understand that everything you once knew has been destroyed, but I'm going to offer you now a new program of physics and metaphysics, a whole new epistemology, a brand new foundation for your knowledge. That is René Descartes. We still read him in philosophy. And if you're learning mathematics, you still learn his mathematics, although his vision of science is not the one we move forward with. But it's still profoundly important during this transitional period because we've left that medieval world behind and we don't have a new world yet. We've got no more medievalism and fragments, glimpses into this new world. So René Descartes loves Galileo. He's also a bit of a coward and happens to know that Galileo is under house arrest. And he doesn't want to get in trouble. He is Catholic, and yet he understands that Galileo is right and he wants to offer a new world system. He actually calls to give you an idea of the scope and ambition of Descartes. He calls his system le monde, the world. But to also give you a sense of perhaps the less than courageous stance of Descartes vis-a-vis the church, he doesn't publish it or allow the whole thing to be published until after he dies. So what we see at first is he gives us a new geometry. So Descartes gives us that analytical geometry. So it's a kind of combination of algebra and geometry. So we can do things like relative speed, size, location, also understand the shape and structure of things. He gives us this analytical geometry that does those tasks. And he says, with this analytical geometry, I can describe the whole world. If you want to understand physics, don't start reading Aristotle. You'll be there all day. Learn my analytical geometry. So what kind of a world can you understand through analytical geometry? A world that fundamentally you can chart on a graph. The Cartesian grid, we've all plotted points on the Cartesian grid, all right? That's this guy. And he's going to say, I know we're in free fall now. We're just in outer space without any frame of reference. Let me give you this piece of graph paper and show you that we can, in fact, take all these pieces of knowledge, all this confusion, all this potential chaos unleashed by the destruction of an old system and the introduction of a new system by creating a reason for everything, an explanation for everything, and a handle for everything, a mathematical handle. So there is not one thing going on in this room that Descartes couldn't fundamentally describe and put on a graph. So the fundamental aspects of nature for Descartes, he was okay, I'm going to say another thing, and this is the only time I'm going to say this. He is a mechanist. He is not an atomist. The mechanical theory that we're going to talk about in class, and the one that is very popular and we move forward with, is actually atomism, atoms in a void. So when we talk about Descartes, unfortunately, he believed in these helical particles spinning in ether. But you're not going to worry about that, but I just don't want to be like not saying that in case you want to find out more about it, because it's fascinating. Okay, so atoms, so we're going to talk about particles. Let's just talk about what his particles do, his particles of matter. So he is drawing on ancient theories that refer to matter as inert and particulate. His particles happen to be little helical things that screw around. Other atomic theories are just atoms that smash each other in a void. The important thing is, there's very simple ways to describe these particles. What position are they? What size are they? How fast are they going? Oh, you told me all those three things about those? Then that is all I need to know. With that, I can plot them on my graph, and since every single piece of matter in this room can be known according to size, position, or speed, everything going on here can be plotted on a graph. And if I need to analyze them in relation to each other, what do you think analytical geometry is for? So this is absolutely masterful. He's described the universe as quantitative versus qualitative. I'm going to say something now about qualities, right? Well, we all know that we can't describe qualitatively that color blue or the way a certain person makes you feel. We can't put that on a graph. This is how reductionist Descartes is. He's saying, look, and this is very Platonist of him. You want to know about the essential reality? That's what we philosophers are. The essential, what's really going on? Every single quality that you see is a secondary characteristic that arises when size, position, motion, size, position, and speed interact with your mind. So when these factors, because things are different sizes, different positions, and blah, blah, blah. When these factors interact with your mind, these secondary qualities arise. So an inferior person, an inferior scholar would involve themselves in the illusion, the psychological illusion of the reality. A superior person, like Descartes, would only involve himself in what is fundamentally real. This is an ontological argument. It's profoundly exciting. He's not just like Aristotle wandering around describing things. He's telling you what is really happening. The other important thing to understand about disenchantment, he adopts the ideas of inertia of Galileo, but he also has a real clarity about motion. There's only one kind of motion in the universe, and this is also something he got from the Greek atomists, those materialists, like Democritus. Only one kind of motion, push-pull mechanics. If you can understand my hands clapping together, you can understand all the motions in the universe. And his analytical geometry can explain all of this motion, because it can tell you speed and position. And the quality of that motion, the only thing you need to know, that type of motion, it's push-pull. If it's not smashing into each other, that's the only kind of motion that exists. Now, he does away with anything spooky. Like, if things have to have contact, right, in order to describe motion, that is fundamentally saying what? That action doesn't happen at a distance. So it's fundamentally saying that if you take a piece of my hair and want to put a spell on me, so you cut my hair off, and you might hold it and do whatever, pins in a doll, you put my hair on, whatever. The idea that my hair is going to have influence on what you're doing with the doll, because there's a mysterious sympathy acting at a distance that like influences like. Remember that Hermetic idea, as above, so below, that the world, because it emanates one thing from another, things don't need to be touching, they don't need to be in contact in order to have reciprocal sympathies and influences and harmonies and effects. But that's spooky. Remember that spooky proliferation of weird spells and magic? Descartes is giving you a world so simple. None of that stuff exists. If something's happening, it's because it is a result of contact force. So if you want to hurt me with my hair, you'd probably have to, strangle me with it, okay? So in a way, what is that? But if not radical disenchantment, because we're talking about driving matter out of the universe. So we talked a little bit about this psychic relief of a quantitative versus a qualitative universe. Remember, we just destroyed the Aristotelian worldview, and we need to build up a worldview from scratch, from nothing. Plus, that Aristotelian worldview was absolutely chaotic. I mean, describing all the different forces of the world, all the different smells, all the different behaviors. Why does a rose smell rosy? Because of the quality of rosiness. Why does salt taste salty? Because of the quality of saltiness, right? I mean, it was a world that was impossible to keep track of quantitatively. For every single thing that exists, there is a unique form that governs its essence and instructs its motion. So all you can do is describe a world like that. You can't really understand it. You can't certainly quantify it. So imagine you're desperate for a whole new world philosophy, and you want to come up with it in one book. This is perfect. We already talked about this. Descartes reduces all those qualities. When he analyzed the smell of the rose, why a rose smells rosy, he would say the way the helical particles are knocking into each other as they travel from the rose through the ether into your nostrils, contact, contact, contact. Contact and motion, you can chart when it's here to when it's here, its relative size, its position, its speed, till it makes it to your nostril. All of that, your mind gives rise to the smell of rosiness. But if we were to get out of your mind and understand, or rather your sense perception, if you just get out of your sense perception, your superficial psychological experience of that rose smelling, and if you're really going to understand it at its most abstract and truest form, all we need to know about that rose are what are the position, size, and speed of those little helical rosy particles. So, and you can do that for everything. Now, that's very nice, Descartes. You've said a lot. You've put everything on a graph. And this is a world mechanists are unbelievably excited to work with. Why? Well, who's the hottest game in town? Galileo. Copernicanism. These are the hot new ideas. This is the stuff, the new irresistible truths. So they are certainly hungry for Cartesian physics, and they love the Cartesian mathematics that lets them actually control, analyze, and understand the nature of this physics. But one slight problem. If you're building all of this knowledge and you're not going to have a real foundation for this knowledge because you're not using either a Catholic epistemology of faith or an Aristotelian epistemology of that type of logical argument based on Aristotelian principles of the universe, then how do you know what you know? And this is how Descartes perfects, right? He saves this breech birth of Galilean mechanics by giving it an epistemology. So it's not just he's telling us everything we can know. He's telling us that we know that we're right for knowing it. Because what's the point of knowing everything if you have no real knowledge that the way you know everything is correct? Ergo, your reading touches on these central positions, the discourse of method, the discourse on method, and Descartes' Meditations. There's two central philosophical texts. And here are the main points. First of all, Descartes has an appropriate initial stance. He wants to do something radically new, right? He wants to take a radical departure. So what's the first thing he has to do? I can't trust tradition, and I can't trust faith. Everything I've been taught so far, whether it was learned in the Bible or handed to me from my parents, all of this stuff has been made up. It's not true. Now, I know nothing. Good. Why? Radical departure from everything that went before. Radical skepticism. He has to doubt everything. Now he's in a bit of a fix, because now he knows essentially that he knows nothing, right? So how is he going to fabricate a new cosmology for modernity? Well, he does know one thing. He knows he is thinking. Now, to be sure, he doesn't even know that what he's thinking is right. Because sometimes he has a dream, and he's feeding a dog, and he thinks he's feeding the dog, and then he wakes up and he realizes, I thought I was feeding the dog, but it turns out I wasn't. And so he has this sense that even the content of what he thinks, tradition can't be right, the Bible not necessarily a sure thing, and even what I think isn't right. But you know what is definitely happening? What nobody can deny? I am thinking, therefore I am. Because I am comes before thinking, right? So I am thinking, therefore I am. Nice tautology. So, il cogito is literally the statement about thought, about thinking. I think, therefore I am. So when you see that word il cogito, it refers to this declaration by Descartes that the whole of his epistemology, all of the elaborate truths, because he is going to end up going from I know nothing all the way from to I know everything, is going to slip through this crucible of this one founding, irrefutable, undeniable truth. I think, therefore I am. If you want to anchor a new worldview, you need like a stake, right? You need something to latch it onto, and this is going to be that stake. This is going to be the first a priori truth that is undeniable, radically true, can't be disproven, because it is true. And everything else now you argue from that premise is going to be true as well. So once you got to think, therefore I am, you get God. Because I know that I'm thinking. I also know that I'm thinking of God. I'm having this innate experience of a pure and perfect being. Now this is very Cartesian in its intellectualism. How could I derive a notion of a pure and perfect being if it didn't actually pre-exist? Because I couldn't derive its form from nothing. See how Platonistic that is? That prior to even being able to have the shape of the idea, it needs to exist in some abstract and a priori realm. So that's great. Descartes has given us God, right? So we're going to move on into this new early modern mechanistic world, and we are going to have a God. However, God is probably not all that delighted to have his existence be subordinate to the fact that Descartes is thinking, and therefore he is. So already, this is human-centered knowledge, because Descartes only knows there's a God, not through faith. Descartes actually derives a logical proof of God. How do people come to God before Descartes? Through faith, through grace, through mystery, through emotion. How are they getting to God now through Descartes? Don't worry about the Bible. What you need to do, you know that you're thinking? Great. Here's a proof of God. So he almost treats God as if he's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So, and again, this is profoundly arrogant. So, and again, these are points I've already made. Descartes' ambitious. He wants the whole enchilada. He wants the whole worldview. So how are we going to get this? Through logical reasoning, not through our senses. This is not, when I say we do not become Cartesianists in modernity, this is not really the true character of science, because Descartes turns away from the senses. The senses can't be trusted. I think in your reading, unless I reduced it, there's that example of the piece of wax that melts, and then was it a wax? Your senses first had it wax being this shape, but now it's this shape. It's still the same piece of wax. Can you entirely trust your senses to know the nature of things, especially when the senses create that false psychological secondary realm? So if you think about it, Descartes' science is not going to be big on observation, on it's not going to be empirically driven. It tells us to distrust sensory data, but what is going to be inherited and certainly passed on to science is the mathematics and the logical reasoning. You don't jump from, even though you're working this out in your mind, you don't randomly jump from point A to point B. You must logically demonstrate how you got from point A to point B, and point A, you can't prove point B unless you've already proven point A. So there's a whole logical chain of reasoning that goes all the way back to he thinks, therefore he is. And from that little point, from a logical chain of reasoning, logical reasoning and mathematics, and some innate ideas, God has given us clear and distinct ideas. From these sources, intellectual sources, we get it. We can understand the full nature of reality. It's a comprehensive system of truth that is enlarged through method. That's why it is the discourse on method. You're not born knowing all this stuff. There is a scientific method, but its method is rationalistic and mathematical. Cartesian physics in metaphysics. Okay, so what is this world then? What is this bold new world of Descartes? Well, one thing that's very interesting, and this is the utter disenchantment of the world, is that all matter is the same. Remember, I mean, certainly Galileo makes this suggestion, and Descartes comes right out and says it. All matter is the same. That means the matter that is constituting a living body is the same thing as the matter that's in a rock. So there's nothing specially enchanted or soulful about matter. Matter is dead. It's absolutely inert. Okay, so Cartesian dualism. Now, he has separated the world into two disparate orders, right? There's this physical world. That physical world that can be charted on a graph is res extensa, Cartesian dualism. These two are radically separate worlds. Res extensa, that which is extended, the thing that is extended, that which has volume, position, and size. Everything in the material world has volume, position, and size, and can be mapped on a graph. But there's also another order, a parallel order that does not interact. Res cogitans, that which thinks. That's where all your mathematical formulations come from. And also, this is the form, this is the ideas, this is the cube squared. Right, I'm sorry. This is the idea of the cube as a to the third power prior to its extension and becoming a physical, voluminous object. The two things are linked in that the world of extension is a priori, there is a world of thought. It's very Platonic prior to this world of extension. But they are radically, radically separate. And so our bodies, animals, we're all machines. Except, as human beings, we have minds. Not to be confused with our brains and our bodies, but part of God's divine will, part of God's divine cogitation exists as part of us. And Descartes also gives us free will because God is free, thought is free. Just to explain this, matter is locked into deterministic mathematical laws. It is forced to obey certain behaviors. But we have free will, which doesn't exist in terms of the laws of matter. So where's this free will coming from? It must come from res cogitans. They don't physically interact, and yet free will is present in this dualistic universe. It is literally, like, for him, the divine presence. Now, we're going to talk about this radical new idea, this mechanism, exciting, bold, yet scary, and people still don't know what to do with it. First of all, he's deriving this atomism from the pagans. And as much as Descartes tries to shove God back into the picture and say, oh yeah, God exists because I'm going to show you a mathematical proof, and by the way, we've got free will, in the universe, so isn't that enough for you? Well, for most people who are still trapped in a sort of religious early modern experience, especially the Catholic Church, this stuff is too toxic, right? And it takes Pierre Gassendi, he's a mathematician and a philosopher and a priest. He's not quite Aquinas, but he is going to make a formulation that the Church, the Catholic Church, who eventually becomes Cartesians, this is going to be the formulation that allows Cartesianism to become reconciled to religion. But what we have right now is a new philosophy, a new natural philosophy, and an old religious theology that are really having a problem with each other, that are in a state of potential war. And societies don't progress if their two main intellectual systems that they're going to need. We're going to need religion and we're going to need science. And right now, nobody's come up with a reconciliation. Descartes puts God in the universe in a way that is unacceptable to most religious people. Gassendi tries to improve that. He says mechanical philosophy doesn't need to be atheistic or mechanistic. If you recall, Church, the Church is trying to banish magic, spookiness, demons from the universe. That's already part of the religious program. Gassendi brings this mechanism and tries to unite it to this anti-magical program by saying something that makes a lot of sense to us. Anybody who's been raised now as a modern Christian is totally comfortable with atomism. You mean the world of matter is inert, it's not spooky and magical, it's not motivated by secret desires? Well, isn't that what the Old Testament would be entirely comfortable with? Isn't it clear that God created matter, that God isn't matter? As devout Christians, aren't you supposed to believe God is radically on high, that God isn't existing in this podium, that God has not enchanted matter, that all spirit, all of this divine essence, in fact, only belongs to God? So Gassendi, we're not there yet, but we see that the Catholic Church, too, is going to have to come to terms. It's going to have to work with mechanism. If it wants to have a place in modernity, it is going to have to make its peace. And there are things about mechanism, because it disenchants the universe and focuses all divine authority in res cogitans, that spiritual realm, that Cartesian dualism can work for the Church. And it's going to be another one of these ways that science and religion come together and push out magic. But it's still too dangerous of an idea. It's still, so we talked about, this is the slide I just talked about, the ways in which Cartesianism is going to start up a flirtation with both Catholicism and Reformation is that, lifeless matter works for Christianity. Remember, they only picked up Aristotelianism because they didn't have a better natural system of philosophy at the time. Maybe if they had, Aristotle wasn't an atomist, and Aristotle happened to be the foremost authority that survived the ancient world. If Aristotle had been an atomist, they would have been atomists, right? So they had to go with Aristotle. It's not necessarily works for them better cosmologically. It's problematic in tons of ways. So it's not, one thing we should be learning is that the Church had an opportunistic relationship with Aristotelian cosmology, and now it's going to have to do the same thing. It's going to have to make a plan to reconcile itself, but we're not there yet. This is the early modern period. We're still surrounded by struggle and strife, but we should see these elements. Promoting rational explanation, that could work for the Church. Proof that God is derived from one's own thoughts. Sola fide, only faith, turn to yourself, reflect within yourself for the highest truth. Don't listen to the priest, don't listen to the patristic fathers, don't listen to people telling you what to do. Turn inward, turn to yourself, find out the truth for yourself. Now, Descartes' truth is purely rationalistic. But can you see how these new philosophies, because you also read Locke, that ask you, to turn to yourself, to position yourself as the foremost authority on what is ultimately true, to turn inward, not outward to tradition, are going to be very important to both modern religion, modern science, and modern selfhood. These are massive changes that are going on. And so this new mechanics, very exciting. It's exciting even to some people in the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, thrilling to the new intellectuals because of these reasons. And we have a new kind of person, too. In the background of all this, which we've mentioned several times before, we have massive transformations going on socially, economically, politically. The church didn't just lose its intellectual authority. The church had lost some of its political power as kings became very, very powerful and were able to sponsor their own universities. And we also have a middle class that is now driving and hungry for education and sponsoring universities through its tuition and pushing the church out. So the church loses its intellectual authority as part of a larger overall sort of the complexity of the society is bringing more people with more power and more diversity. So it's just not the church playing this game. And now we have this other characteristic of these new scientists, these new natural philosophers. And they are also excited, not just by Descartes, but they've been very much mobilized by philosophers like Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon publishes this book, The New Organon, and it says, "Many shall pass to and fro, and science shall be increased." Well, the cover is supposed to be the Pillars of Hercules, and there's a boat, a ship, that is going through them into the great unknown. The Pillars of Hercules is a metaphor, a symbol for the Straits of Gibraltar, the gateway to the Atlantic. Bacon also writes a utopian novel, The New Atlantis. You've got a whole new class of people that aren't looking to the past, that aren't looking to religion, that are looking to nature to explore, to observe, to expound, to reason, and to expand this new kind of social and political power. And it is being fueled by tremendous trade. We've got, that's no accident, this scientific treatise that is being linked to what? The age of empire, the age of imperialism and exploration, finding new peoples, right? Finding new sources of wealth and trade. So there's an injection into all this intellectual activity I've been talking about. We've got a massive injection of wealth and knowledge and a new class of people. This new class of people, we don't have the word scientist yet, but this new natural philosopher who understands he has a mission. This boat, back in the days of antiquity, when you get to the Straits of Gibraltar, when you get to the Pillars of Hercules, turn your ship around. There's a reason why in ancient Rome, we don't have stories of exploration. We don't have stories of discovering South America and North America. But now we have this spirit of discovery, a sort of a burgeoning curiosity, power, and wealth that can't be contained. And it's symbolized in this ship that is going places man has never gone before. And it's a scientific manual. So there's this sense that science, not tradition, not religion, not even the kings, who's commanding this ship? Who's pushing us ever outward, farther and farther? The scientists are. That is the leading edge of society. But these scientists, who are they? Right, as we know them today, you know, huge amounts of funding, institutions, universities, think tanks, corporations, you name it, they're hugely powerful. But who were they in the 1600s? You don't necessarily, just the way you don't want to be the handmaiden of the church, you don't want to be the handmaiden of some king. Now, princes were very interested in promoting science. They loved to find out about how to build a better ship, better ballistics. Those were really big in the 1600s. A lot of the technological advances were cannons and how thick you can make walls. But science was something more than that. It was a moral vision of exploration, pushing beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. You had these natural philosophers that wanted their own intellectual, cultural space, but it didn't exist yet. The universities were still very controlled by the church, and you had a lot of the sort of experimental science being very controlled by the agenda of kings. And that's why at this time, when we start getting not just Descartes' new philosophy, but new Cartesian philosophers, this whole new class of people that said, look, we need independence, we need resources, we need an institution of our own. So one of the earliest is the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660. It's called the Royal Society. They didn't take any money from the king. Now, these are all going to be still educated elite people with resources of their own, but it's important. They wanted independence. And why is this revolutionary? Rather than controlling information in a top-down way funneled through the church's Aristotelian program in the universe, in the universities, now you have a royal society. And if you can't go to the meetings, there's royal transactions, proceedings of the meetings. We got a printing press, we got literate people, we got smart people. Now all of these minds are all working together in a sort of invisible republic of these new philosophers are creating their own invisible institutions by having philosophical transactions that keeps every member up to the moment with the latest discoveries. Science is orthodox. They're not all off in a corner like the Magus was off in his tower or in a basement working on his discoveries on his own. Or Galileo had to find the sponsorship of the Medici. That had to be the Medicean stars. But now science is finding its own protective organizations. And it's science for whose sake? Science for science's sake. And so we're now going to get this new class of natural philosopher, not the handmaiden of religion, not subordinate to any king, but working and with not just a scientific vision, but also a moral vision as well, as we will discuss with Locke and Newton. So all I'm going to say is office hours today, Tuesday, and also Thursday. I'm extending. I have to leave at 3 today, but I'm going to extend office hours on Thursday and next Tuesday to help you prepare for the exam. So I can stay pretty late. So if you need me to stay past 4, let me know. But I plan to be there from 2 to 4 on Thursday and next Tuesday.